It's election day, April 1st, 1924. Cicero, Illinois. By 9 a.m. something feels off. The streets, normally calm and routine, are filled with unfamiliar men, their suits too sharp for this working-class town. They stand outside the polling stations like soldiers waiting for orders. But these men aren't voters, they're enforcers. Al Capone's men. And they've already started their work. A local election judge, William Flom, notices something's wrong, suspicious men casting multiple ballots. He steps up to challenge them, but before he can say a word, he's grabbed, dragged into an alley and beaten senseless. His jaws shattered, his ribs cracked. His body's left in the dirt as a warning to anyone else thinking of interfering. Meanwhile, at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, another election worker, John Veretto, sees the fraud happening in plain sight. He tries to report it, but Capone's men have no patience for whistleblowers. They throw him into a car, take him to an abandoned factory, and beat him into silence. The town's on edge. Word spreads fast. The press shows up, cameras rolling, reporters documenting the violence. They see the intimidation, the ballot box stuffing, the threats. Capone's army is making sure that the only vote that counts is the one they've rigged. By 2 p.m., the tension in the air is palpable. Chicago's police force, 70 squad cars strong, arrives in Cicero. The stage is set for a confrontation, an all-out battle between Capone's men and the law. At the corner of Cicero Avenue and 22nd Street, the conflict ignites. Frank Capone, Al's older brother, is caught in the crossfire. He pulls a revolver, but before he can make a move, two detectives, McGlynn and Dougherty, fire first. Frank Capone's body hits the pavement. Al Capone, ever the strategist, doesn't flinch. He watches as his brother dies, then calmly issues orders to his men to pull back. The election's already been won. The votes are counted. Capone's candidates have taken every office. By nightfall, Cicero is his. The mayor's on his payroll, the council's on his payroll, the police, his personal army. Cicero isn't a town anymore. It's a territory, and it belongs to Capone. Al Capone didn't just walk into Cicero to win an election. He walked in to make a statement. With the election over, the town is his. The mayor, the judges, the cops, they're all in his pocket now. Anyone who was once in power, they answer to Capone now. He's not just the kingpin of a city anymore, he's the ruler of an empire, and Cicero's just the start. But Capone's not the kind of man to leave things to chance. The work's just beginning. He's got the mayor on his side, sure, but he's going further than that. Step by step, Capone's making sure the whole town is under his thumb. The police. They're no longer there to protect the people. They're there to protect Capone's operations. Officers are getting fat with cash, bribed into ignoring his breweries and illegal bars. What was once a force for the law, now it's his personal security detail. Capone's influence extends beyond the cops. He starts making deals with the town's politicians, greasing the palms of anyone who can get him what he wants. And the ones who resist, they don't last long. It's not just about bribery anymore. Capone is systematically taking over every part of Cicero's infrastructure. His reach is in every business, every home, every street. If you're not on Capone's side, you're out of luck. And if you think the violence ends now that he's in power, think again. Capone's men are still running the streets. Anyone who dares to challenge his rule gets a visit, a beating, a warning, or worse. If you don't comply, you disappear. But there's one thing Capone can't control: his enemies. They're scattered, small groups of people just starting to find their footing. Citizens who know what's happening but don't know how to fight it. Reformers trying to claw their way back to justice. And they're getting bold. They don't realize, though, Capone's already 3 steps ahead. His informants are everywhere. There's no escape. No one can hide, but there's a twist coming. One that will make Capone's empire look fragile. The feds, they're not like the rest. They can't be bribed, they can't be bought, and they're coming for Capone. They'll start small, a few raids, a few arrests. But they're working their way up, and when they reach Capone's inner circle, it'll shake the entire foundation of his criminal empire. Capone's never faced anything like this before, but he's calm, calculating, and he'll do whatever it takes to keep his grip on power. But even the kingpin knows there's no such thing as invincibility, and that's when the real battle begins. The feds are closing in. They've got a plan, a team, and they're not here to play games. Al Capone knows this is the one thing he can't buy off. The Prohibition Bureau, led by a man named Elliot Ness, is starting to make noise. They've got the grit to take Capone down, and unlike the local cops and judges, they don't care about money. They care about busting him wide open. Ness's team, dubbed the Untouchables, begins to make strategic moves. They start raiding Capone's breweries, shutting down his operations one by one. They seize equipment, arrest workers, and cause a dent in his profits. But Capone, he's still calm. He's been through worse. He knows this isn't a full-blown war yet. It's just a nuisance. He's seen people come after him before, and they've always folded when they realize they can't play the game like he does. Yet there's something different about this. The feds are relentless. They're not scared of the same threats that would send other men running. They're going after his wallet, after his books, after the money trail that he's kept hidden for years. But Capone's always been 2 steps ahead. He knows that as long as he can keep his empire running, he can ride out the storm. But the feds, they're not just looking to take down his operations. They're looking to destroy his life. And when the IRS steps in, that's when the ground starts to shift. They don't care about the illegal booze. They care about the money Capone's been hiding. Tax evasion. The feds know they can't get him on murder or bootlegging, but tax evasion, that's a different game entirely. They start piecing things together: financial records, witness testimony, the fact that Capone's living large while reporting nothing. They've got enough to make a case. And Capone, he's starting to feel the heat. He's been living under the radar for years, but now everything's coming to a head. The feds are about to make their move, and they're not backing down. It's only a matter of time. But the question is, how long can Capone keep his empire running while the walls close in? Capone's empire is starting to crack. Every move he makes, every bribe he pays, every word he whispers is starting to feel like it's under a microscope. The feds are relentless. And though Capone's always been the one pulling the strings, now it feels like the strings are slipping out of his control. He thought he could ride out the storm, thought that his money, his power would protect him. But the feds have a different game plan. The pressure's mounting. Capone's feeling the heat, but he doesn't show it. Not yet. He's still calculating, still thinking. He's got men in place, connections that run deep, but the deeper the investigation goes, the closer they get to his secrets. Al Capone has always played dirty. He's done it for years, but the feds, they're different. They're after something bigger, something he can't just buy off or scare away. And with every move they make, Capone realizes one thing: his time might be running out. The raids keep coming. They start raiding Capone's gambling dens, his brothels, his protection rackets. His men are getting arrested. His operations are getting hit hard. But the feds aren't satisfied with just disrupting his businesses. They're going after the man himself. Capone doesn't scare easily, but even he can feel the walls closing in. He's got money, he's got power, but now he's fighting against an entire system. And he's starting to realize just how fragile his empire really is. The feds are working their way up. They're gathering evidence, tightening their grip, and Capone's getting nervous. He's never been one to back down, but the truth is, the feds are playing a game he hasn't been able to control. He needs to act fast. But what can he do when the law is no longer on his side? The stakes are higher than ever now. Capone can see the end game coming, and it's not looking good for him. The question is, how far will he go to keep his empire intact? Capone's empire is slipping, but he's not done yet. Every day, his world feels a little smaller. The feds have his financial records, his bribes, and his connections. They're piecing it together, and the case against him is starting to look airtight. But Capone's a man who knows how to survive. He's survived street fights, betrayals, and rival gangsters trying to take him down. And right now, the feds are no different. He's playing his cards, trying to keep the game alive. But the pressure, it's unbearable. He's used to controlling the streets, manipulating everyone around him. But now the law is closing in, and there's nowhere left to run. Capone's never been afraid of violence, but this is something he can't fight with his fists. The feds aren't playing by the rules. They're taking him on in a way he's never seen before. They've got evidence he can't erase. They're relentless, they're strategic, and they won't stop until they've got him where they want him. Capone's back is against the wall. He's still got money, still got power, but the law is finally catching up with him. Every bribe he's paid, every deal he's made, is now a piece of the puzzle the feds are putting together. The end is coming for Capone. He's known it for a while, but he never expected it to feel like this. All his moves, his years of ruthless control, are about to come crumbling down. And now he's just trying to stay one step ahead. But for how long? The feds have him cornered. Capone's world, the empire he built with blood and money, is crashing down around him. His every move is being watched. His wealth, his power, his networks, none of it can protect him now. The final blow is coming. The feds have everything they need: financial records, wiretaps, witness testimony. They've been building their case for months, and now they've got Capone where they want him. And this time he can't escape. The courtroom is set. The trial is underway. Capone, once untouchable, is now facing the consequences of his empire. For the first time in his life, he can't buy his way out. He can't bribe the right people. The law is catching up, and it's unforgiving. The pressure is suffocating. Capone stands trial, his future hanging in the balance. The charges: tax evasion. He's been hiding millions, using the cash to live a life of luxury while the law was left in the dust. The jury doesn't hesitate. Capone's conviction is swift. He's sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The man who ruled Chicago and beyond is now behind bars, stripped of everything he built. But even in prison, Capone's influence doesn't disappear. He's sent to Atlanta, then to Alcatraz, isolated, cut off from his empire. The man who once had the world at his feet is now a broken shell of himself. The empire, it's falling apart without him. His men scatter, trying to pick up the pieces, but without Capone's leadership, nothing holds together. And then the final blow: Prohibition ends. The 21st Amendment repeals the law that built Capone's empire. Alcohol's legal again. The money that flowed in from bootlegging dries up. Capone's reign is over. The world that once bowed to him has moved on. Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in American history, is no longer the king. And just like that, his empire crumbles. Capone's time in prison isn't just a physical sentence. It's the unraveling of everything he once was. He arrives at Alcatraz, the maximum security prison on an isolated island in the middle of the bay. The place is a fortress. Once you're in, there's no way out. And for Capone, it's a place where power means nothing. No more late-night meetings with his men. No more control over the streets of Chicago. No more whispers of loyalty in the backrooms of bars and speakeasies. He's alone now, isolated in a cell, surrounded by nothing but walls and the heavy silence of his own downfall. But Al Capone wasn't built to just fade away. He tries to maintain his grip, even here. He tries to keep up the persona, the kingpin who commands respect. But it's hard to do that when your enemies are the ones holding the keys to your cell. The inmates at Alcatraz know who he is. They know the name, the legend. But it's different now. There's no fear of him here. No underworld connections to call in favors. Just a man, an old man broken by time and his own mistakes. Capone starts to deteriorate. His health crumbles. Syphilis, the disease he'd been battling for years, takes hold. The effects are unmistakable. His mind, once sharp and calculating, begins to slip. He's not the same man who once ruled with an iron fist. The sharp eyes, the quiet menace, they're fading away, replaced by confusion, paranoia, and vulnerability. And then in 1939, after 7 years behind bars, Al Capone is released. His sentence is shortened for good behavior, but the man who walks out of prison is not the man who walked in. He's a shell of his former self. The Capone who once commanded the streets of Chicago is now lost to illness and age. His empire is gone. His money is gone. His power is gone. He spends his last years in a mansion in Miami, living in a haze of memories, his body slowly shutting down. His days are filled with confusion. His sharp mind, the one that once saw everything in the game, now barely functions. The man who once ruled with violence and cunning is now at the mercy of his own frailty. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947. The kingpin who had once held the city in his grip was now a forgotten relic of a violent, bygone era. His empire, it collapsed with him. And just like that, the reign of one of the most notorious gangsters in American history ended, not with a final shot, but with the slow decay of time and illness. The streets Capone once controlled would go on. The city would change, as all things do. But the legend of Capone, the story of his rise and fall, would remain etched in the fabric of Chicago's criminal history. Capone's death didn't just mark the end of an era, it was the final chapter in a long, dark story. The empire he built with blood, intimidation, and corruption no longer existed. But what remained wasn't just the wreckage of his operations. It was the legacy he left behind. A legacy that reshaped the criminal world. Even in his final years, Capone's name still carried weight. His rise to power, his brutality, his ability to manipulate both the streets and the system, those things weren't forgotten. In the underworld, where respect is earned through fear and loyalty, Capone's name was like a ghost that haunted the halls of every speakeasy, every underground casino, every barbershop where the deals were made. But his fall, that was a warning. A reminder to the next generation of gangsters that even the strongest, the smartest, the most ruthless can be brought down. As Capone's empire crumbled, others started to rise. The vacuum he left was filled with new blood. Young gangsters, men who had watched Capone from the shadows, took notes on his mistakes. They learned from his missteps, how he underestimated the power of law enforcement, how he overplayed his hand, how the empire he built on fear eventually turned on him. And they made sure to play it differently. Capone's methods might have worked for a time, but the world was changing. The money made from bootlegging dried up. The laws changed, and so did the game. What once was his empire, the breweries, the casinos, the gambling dens, now belonged to men who were smarter, more strategic, and far less visible. The streets Capone once walked are now filled with whispers of a different kind. The old ways are dying, but the shadow of his influence never fully disappears. His name still pops up in conversation, in the stories told over drinks, in the lessons taught by the older generation of criminals. Capone's empire fell, but the spirit of what he built, that willingness to do anything, to control everything, still lingers. The rules may have changed, but the game is the same. And in the end, isn't that what Capone understood the best? The game never ends. It just changes players. The fall of Capone left a scar on Chicago's streets, but the world kept moving forward, shifting with time. Capone's name still carried weight even after his death. His legend was too big to fade, his tactics too brutal to be forgotten. Every gangster, every rising figure in the criminal world knew Capone's story. They learned from it, and they knew what it took to build an empire like his, how ruthless, how intelligent, how violent you had to be. But they also knew one thing. Capone's downfall was waiting for anyone who thought they could run a show like he did. The city, once ruled by fear, wasn't the same. The days of open battles in the streets, of violence as a way of life, started to blur. Prohibition was over. The money from bootlegging disappeared, replaced by new, more dangerous games. Drugs, gambling, and other illegal businesses started to rise, but they operated under the radar. They learned from Capone's mistakes. Where Al's empire had been built on visibility, intimidation, and brute force, the new gangsters learned how to play it quieter, smarter. They knew they had to be invisible to survive. And yet, Capone's legacy didn't vanish. It was in every corner of the city. Every time a new deal was made, every time a competitor was silenced, every time someone rose to power, there was a trace of Capone's influence. It was in the way the underworld moved, in how gangsters talked about loyalty, control, and power. Al Capone may have lost his empire, but he changed the game forever. He showed the world just how fragile the line between law and crime could be. He proved that with enough money and enough muscle, even a system designed to protect the people could be bent to the will of one man. And while his empire was crumbling, the foundation he laid, violence, intimidation, control, would always be part of the game. And so, As new players entered the world he once ruled, the game went on. The streets of Chicago weren't free from crime. They were just different. In the end, Capone's death didn't end his story. It only made it a warning to those who would rise and think they were untouchable. The game would continue, but no one would ever forget how Capone showed them the way. And when the next man came, they'd know exactly how high the stakes were. As time passed, the legend of Al Capone didn't just fade away, it evolved. New men, younger faces, took over, but they carried pieces of Capone's world with them. They played smarter, blending into shadows rather than flaunting their power in broad daylight. They learned the art of invisibility. The world Capone built was now fractured. His empire, once held together by fear and blood, had been chipped away piece by piece. But the effects were still visible, the cracks in the foundation, the way the game was played. Capone may have been silenced, but his blueprint remained. The new players understood the dynamics of control, how power could be bought, how loyalty could be bent with the right touch of cash, and how to maintain order with the threat of violence always lurking in the background. They didn't need to be as overt as Capone. They were smarter. They knew when to step back and when to strike. The underworld wasn't about muscle anymore. It was about manipulation, subtlety, and making sure no one knew you were running the show. But not everyone adapted. Not everyone learned from Capone's mistakes. A few, too bold, tried to recreate his empire, thinking they could repeat his methods. But the world had changed. The police force was more organized, the law more determined, and technology was beginning to shift how crimes were investigated. The old-school ways of doing business started to crumble again, just as Capone's empire had. The feds, they didn't forget him. The lessons Capone left behind. They stayed in their minds and they watched closely as the new players emerged. Every time a new gangster rose, they remembered the mistakes of the past. The Prohibition Bureau might have fallen, but a new force was taking shape. The IRS continued to evolve, and this time they weren't just looking at bootlegging. They were looking at everything, every financial movement, every dirty dollar that flowed under the surface. Capone's downfall had been a warning. His empire had crumbled, but the system that let him rise to the top remained in place. And the next man who thought he could just buy his way to the top, he'd soon find out that the game was still rigged, but this time the players were smarter and the rules were tighter. Capone had created a monster, one that couldn't be stopped by a simple raid or a few arrests. The monster wasn't just Capone. It was the system, the way power flowed and how easy it was to buy and bend the rules. The next generation of gangsters didn't just learn how to navigate the system, they learned how to manipulate it. So the game continued. Different players, same tricks, same street corner deals. But in the shadows, Al Capone's name lived on, not as a man but as a symbol of what the game could do and the price it demanded. His rise had been fast, his fall faster, but his legacy, it was permanent. Because in the end, the game never ends, it just keeps going. Years roll by, and with each passing day, the streets of Chicago shift. The names change, the faces become new, but the game, it remains timeless. The players adjust, the tactics evolve, but the core of the game stays the same: power, loyalty, control, and how much blood you're willing to spill to get it. Capone's empire may have crumbled, but in the cracks, the seeds of a new generation were sown. A new kind of gangster, smarter, more dangerous. The kind who stayed hidden in plain sight, who pulled the strings from behind the curtain, who never had to raise a gun but knew exactly when and where to apply pressure. The underworld adapted. Where Capone had once been a public figure, an in-your-face symbol of crime, the new players learned how to operate without being seen. They were the masters of subtlety. They didn't walk into bars with machine guns announcing their power. No, now it was about buying silence, about control through wealth, manipulation, and clever deals. But the old guard didn't just fade away. They watched, they waited, they learned. And sometimes they struck quietly, efficiently. And when they did, they made sure to remind everyone that they were still there, still watching, still in control. But as the game continued, so did the risk. The walls Capone had once broken through, the systems he'd corrupted, were beginning to rebuild themselves. Law enforcement was better organized. New blood in the feds, new technology for tracking money and criminals. The old ways were slipping into obsolescence, and the younger generation had to adapt to stay ahead of the curve. And still, Capone's name lingers. The gangsters who came after him know the story. The man who took a town and turned it into his own personal empire only to lose it all. They remember how the game can chew you up, how it can make kings into pawns in the blink of an eye. It's a reminder, a warning. The game may change, but it never ends. Even now, decades after Capone's death, the streets of Chicago carry his legacy. The power, the danger, the reminder of what happens when you think you can't be touched. And as the city hums, as the new players rise to take their place in the shadows, Capone's ghost watches. He might be gone, but the game he played is still being played. The rules are just a little different now, but they're still his rules. But the game, like everything else in Chicago, never stays quiet for long. Capone's empire might have fallen, but it left behind something far more dangerous than just empty streets and crumbled businesses. It left a blueprint. And there were always those ready to follow it, to learn from the mistakes, to build something newer, smarter, more covert. The city that Capone once controlled. It was now a breeding ground for those who wanted to rewrite the rules. And they weren't waiting for another Capone. They didn't need him. They understood the weight of his name, the power in his rise and fall. These new players were all about control, but this time the public face of crime was different. There were no more grand gestures, no more chaotic shootouts in the streets. The streets didn't need the theatrics anymore. The game had evolved, the players changed, but the hunger for power remained the same. And in the shadows, Capone's story became a dark myth, a legend spoken in whispers in backrooms and dark alleys. The man who could buy anyone, the man who made Chicago bow before him, and the man who, in the end, got consumed by the very system he thought he could control. But it didn't stop the next wave from trying. The legacy Capone left behind wasn't just his criminal empire. It was the idea that one man, with enough money and muscle, could bend a city to his will. That at the end of the day, the law could be bought, loyalty could be paid for, and fear could be used as the ultimate tool of power. Capone's empire had crumbled, but the foundation he laid, it would never truly disappear. New gangsters, new players, some known, some in the shadows, started to understand that the real power wasn't in the flash of violence. It was in control, subtle, quiet, calculated, and in the end, that's what made the game so dangerous. Because no matter how many times the empire fell, someone was always ready to rebuild it. But as the years passed, one thing became clear. The game had a way of coming full circle. The players changed, sure. The faces, the names, the methods, they evolved. But the hunger, the drive, the thirst for power never faded. Cicero, once Al Capone's stronghold, became a ghost of its former self. The corruption, the police force, the politicians on his payroll, they were all part of the past now. But the city's landscape had been altered forever. The corruption that Capone had woven into the fabric of the town still lingered like a bad memory that refused to die. The new players were smarter, quieter. They didn't need to storm the streets like Capone's men had done. No, they were surgical, subtle. They understood that power wasn't just in violence. It was in knowing when to act and when to wait. It was about moving in the shadows, keeping your enemies guessing, and making sure you were always 10 steps ahead. Capone's name was still feared. Not because people expected him to rise again, but because they understood what his legacy represented. He was a symbol, a warning. The man who built an empire but in the end was brought down by the very power he had wielded. And that was the part of the story that still haunted the city. Even as the streets were now controlled by new players, men who learned from Capone's mistakes, his ghost lingered. The police, the politicians, the underworld, it was all part of the same vicious cycle. Every time a new gangster rose, the city watched closely, wondering if this one would be the next to try and pull off what Capone had done. But each time the same thing happened. They got too greedy, too reckless. They pushed too far and the system pushed back. Capone's story was a reminder that in the game there was always a price to pay. His rise, his fall, it was all part of the rhythm of the streets. The game would never end, but it would never forget him either. He was the man who showed that if you wanted to rule, you had to be willing to destroy everything and everyone standing in your way. And as the years went on, as the city shifted and the players changed, one truth remained. No matter how much time passed, Capone's legacy would never truly fade. It was a dangerous game, and Capone had played it better than anyone. But in the end, even the best players get played. Understood. I'll expand the story, diving deep into the aftermath of Capone's reign, the rise of new players, and the continued influence of his empire in the shadows. This will be a detailed continuation with a focus on the broader impact Capone left behind. When Capone's empire collapsed, it didn't simply disappear. The streets of Chicago, once ruled by the most infamous gangster to ever walk them, began to feel like a new city, a city that had learned from the mistakes of the past. The violence, the brutality, the high-profile battles in the streets, all of it was behind them. Yet the ghost of Capone lingered. For years, Capone had commanded a criminal empire that stretched far beyond Cicero. His bootlegging operations had created a wealth so vast, it fueled not only the underworld, but had also left a stain on the very fabric of the city's institutions. Once the empire fell, the pillars of corruption that supported it crumbled, but not without leaving cracks in the system that would remain for decades. As Capone's arrest and subsequent conviction for tax evasion began to make headlines, those in the underworld knew something was coming. They knew the days of rampant lawlessness were ending. The rise of law enforcement, of federal agents and organized crackdowns, would put an end to the excesses that Capone once indulged in. But just as quickly as the walls closed in on Capone, they began to open for the next generation. In the wake of Capone's downfall, the vacuum of power was immediate and profound. Capone's empire may have been shattered, but the criminal world didn't stop. Men with less ambition but just as much hunger filled the void, carefully studying Capone's rise and fall. They had the blueprint now. Capone had shown them the way to power, and his mistakes were now lessons to be learned. These new players weren't interested in making the same blunders. They weren't looking for headlines, not for the fame and spectacle that Capone had relished. No, they understood that in the game of power, it's the quietest players who can sometimes make the biggest moves. But Chicago, with its deep roots in corruption and violence, wasn't ready to change overnight. The old systems of power, those networks that Capone had once exploited, were still in place. The police, while no longer openly corrupt in the way they had been during Capone's reign, still carried the remnants of that influence. Some officers were still susceptible to bribes, others had connections that were harder to sever than anyone realized. The city's politics. They weren't free of Capone's reach either. Though Capone was gone, his legacy of how to manipulate the system, how to keep the politicians and the law enforcement on your side, had been instilled in the next wave of criminals. The federal crackdown on Capone, led by agents like Elliot Ness, had forced a shift, but the streets of Chicago had a memory. The underworld, even with the disruption caused by the feds, found ways to adapt. They moved faster, smarter. They no longer needed to command the city's politicians or openly control the police force. The new players understood that the game was no longer about visibility. It was about control in the shadows. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the criminals who came after Capone quickly understood this new dynamic. The game had evolved. No longer was it a battle of street wars and headlines. The real power now lay in the manipulation of money, connections, and information. The FBI was there, watching, waiting for someone to slip up, but the players of this new game had learned how to keep their cards close to their chest. The first to rise was a man named Frank Nitti, who had been one of Capone's most trusted lieutenants. He had seen firsthand what it took to run the operation, and now, with Capone out of the picture, he sought to carve out his own piece of the empire. Nitti, though far more low-key than Capone, had the right mix of ruthlessness and strategy. He wasn't as flashy. He didn't want to make the same noise that Capone had. He learned quickly that a quiet, efficient operation was the way to go in this new world. Still, as powerful as he became, The shadow of Capone's legacy hung over him. The feds had their eyes on him, just as they had on Capone. The difference now was that the streets had learned to adapt faster than the law could keep up. While Nitti tried to maintain a low profile, there were still those who clung to the old ways. The violence never truly left the city. It just became more strategic. Those who wanted to challenge Nitti's control knew the risks, but they also understood that the rewards were immense. Power could still be seized, but it would require more than just muscle. It would take subtlety, strategy, and the ability to manipulate the right people at the right time. In the underworld, one lesson was clear. Even though Capone's reign was over, the game had only grown more dangerous. The tactics had evolved, but the prize remained the same: control of the city, control of the streets, and ultimately, the power to shape the future. As the decades passed, a new generation rose. Young men who had heard stories of Capone, of his empire and his fall, began to carve out their own territories. They studied Capone's rise from nothing to the most feared gangster in America. They studied his fall, too, because they knew that in the world they inhabited, there were no guarantees. You either learned from Capone's mistakes or you died trying. The late 1940s and 1950s marked a time of transition in Chicago. The old players had mostly faded away, replaced by men who understood the need for discretion. The city had learned a hard lesson. Too much visibility brought attention. Too much noise invited the law to your door. The game was played quietly now. The alcohol and bootlegging had lost their glamour, replaced by gambling, drugs, and labor racketeering. But despite these changes, one thing remained. The power to control Chicago's streets was still up for grabs. And just like Capone, the new men who rose to power were never just about the money. They were about control. They knew that the real currency in Chicago wasn't cash, it was influence. It was having the right people on your side, the police officers, the judges, the politicians. If you controlled the city's infrastructure, its very pulse, you could do anything. You could make billions without ever showing your face in public. But as history had shown, the city never stayed quiet for long. A new force was emerging. The feds had become better organized, more ruthless and more relentless. Their targets were shifting. They weren't just looking for the gangsters who made too much noise. They were looking for the hidden ones, the ones who thought they could operate unnoticed. They were learning how to play the game, too. Yet, even with the rise of federal scrutiny, the game never truly stopped. Criminals adapted, they always did. And Chicago, the city that Capone once ruled with an iron fist, was now a city where shadows moved in every corner. Capone had been the kingpin, the face of the underworld. His rise and fall were public spectacles, but his legacy, that was the blueprint. It was the quiet ones who would inherit the game, the ones who would never let you see them coming. And the city, it would always be a place where power, whether legal or illegal, could be bought. You just had to know how to play. The streets Capone had once ruled would never forget him. The stories would never fade. The game, it would always be the same, but the players would change. And in the end, those who controlled the game were the ones who stayed out of sight, pulling the strings from the shadows. Chicago's streets never truly let go of the past. Even as decades passed, the city retained a quiet hum, a pulse that reminded everyone that the underworld was still there, quietly shaping the lives of everyone around it. Al Capone may have been gone, but his presence lingered, like a shadow that never fully faded. The men who rose to take his place didn't just inherit his methods, they inherited his vision. They understood the most important lesson Capone had ever taught. In this game, visibility is a weakness and discretion is power. But as the 1950s rolled in, the world around the underworld began to change. The days of mobsters ruling openly, making deals in back alleys and corner bars, were starting to seem like a relic of a bygone era. The world was evolving. The police were becoming more sophisticated, organized, and powerful. The government was watching more closely, and the public wasn't as tolerant of the obvious corruption that had once been so pervasive. The days of men like Capone were numbered. The game was shifting, but it hadn't disappeared. The streets of Chicago became a battleground for those who wanted to play the game in a new way, and the new players didn't want to make the same mistakes Capone did. They understood that the violence, the obvious brutality, was what had caused Capone's downfall. They had to be smarter. They had to be quieter. They had to make money without ever drawing too much attention to themselves. The next generation was more cautious. They knew that the system was watching, and they understood that the key to survival wasn't just in muscle and fear. It was in knowledge. Control the flow of information, control the streets, and you'd be untouchable. But even as these new players learned from the past, one thing was clear: the game never truly changed. It didn't matter who was in power, what methods were used, or how many laws were passed to fight it. The hunger for power, the desire to control, would always be there. Frank Nitti had tried to fill the void left by Capone's empire. He had taken control of the rackets, but he was Capone. He didn't have the same magnetism, the same overwhelming presence that Capone had once wielded. Nitti's reign, though effective, wasn't the same as Capone's. He stayed out of the public eye, kept his operations quiet, but in doing so, he missed the mark that Capone had hit. Capone had built an empire by making his presence known, by intimidating and manipulating with force. Nitti, for all his success, lacked that same indomitable will to stand in the light. It wasn't long before Nitti's empire started to show signs of strain. Federal agents, the same ones who had taken down Capone, began to target him. Nitti wasn't as careless as Capone had been, but in the world of organized crime, even the smallest mistake could lead to destruction. The feds had learned from the mistakes they made when they went after Capone. They were patient now, more strategic, more focused. Nitti knew he was being hunted, but he wasn't the kind of man who showed weakness. He stayed in the shadows, making sure his operations ran smoothly, making sure no one connected him directly to the crimes being committed in his name. But the noose was tightening, and the whispers on the street said it wouldn't be long before his time ran out. But even as Nitti's grip on Chicago began to loosen, the underworld shifted in ways Capone would have never imagined. The new criminals, the ones who came after Capone, didn't just operate on the streets of Chicago. They were global. They had access to information, to networks, to resources that Capone could never have dreamed of. The world was smaller now, connected by a new form of communication, a form Capone never saw coming: the telephone, the internet, and the financial systems that allowed criminals to operate far beyond the boundaries of a single city. The world of organized crime was becoming more sophisticated. The mobsters who had once relied on street-level violence, who had made their living off bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets, now found themselves in a new game. It wasn't about brute force anymore. It was about influence, about controlling the flow of information, about making moves behind the scenes without ever leaving a mark. It was about becoming untouchable in ways that Capone had never even dreamed of. The rise of the new generation of criminals, the ones who played the game in the shadows, meant that the old guard of Chicago's underworld was now a relic. The violent, chaotic days of Capone were over. They had been replaced by a new breed of gangster, smarter, quieter, and more dangerous than ever. The power that Capone had once held in his hands now belonged to men who didn't want to be seen. They didn't need to be feared in the same way Capone had been. They knew the real power lay in controlling the money, controlling the information, and staying under the radar. But Chicago, like any city, had its own way of remembering the past. The ghost of Capone never truly left, and the streets, though quieter, still whispered his name. The new players who had come to replace him understood that they couldn't escape his shadow. They couldn't ignore the fact that Capone had shown them the way. His empire may have fallen, but the lessons he left behind were still valuable. As the years passed and the underworld evolved, one thing remained constant: the hunger for power. And in the quiet of Chicago streets, in the shadows where the real deals were made, Capone's legacy lived on. Not in the violence, not in the headlines, but in the cold, calculated decisions made by those who understood that in this game, the only rule was survival. And so, as the new players continued to rise, As the underworld shifted and adapted to new realities, Capone's story, his rise and fall, remained a reminder to all who played the game. No matter how carefully you hide, no matter how much power you accumulate, the game will always come for you. Even as the years passed, the streets of Chicago never truly forgot Al Capone. They may have moved on, they may have tried to erase his name from their memories, but the echoes of his reign were still there, hidden beneath the city's surface, just out of sight, but never completely gone. Capone's legacy wasn't just in his violence or in the empire he built. It was in the very foundation of the city's underworld. His influence still permeated every corner of Chicago. New players entered the game, and while they didn't always wear the same clothes or play with the same rules, they followed the same unspoken code Capone had established. And they learned quickly. The criminals who rose after Capone understood that to control the game, you needed more than muscle. They were smart. They saw what Capone had done wrong. He'd been too visible, too reckless. They didn't want to repeat his mistakes. These men operated in shadows, hidden behind closed doors, making their moves in ways Capone never had the chance to understand. But Chicago was still Chicago. It was a city built on secrets and power, where the underworld ran just as deep as the legitimate businesses. And those who didn't learn the lessons of the past, the ones who sought to rise too quickly, who let their egos take over, were never long for this world. Capone had learned that lesson the hard way. His own ambition had been his downfall, and for the new breed of gangster it was a lesson they carried with them every day. While the old-school methods of crime, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, still held sway in parts of the city, the real money was changing. It wasn't about alcohol or dice anymore. The underworld had expanded, evolved, and so had the way business was done. Drugs were on the rise, and with them came new kinds of criminal syndicates, ones who understood that controlling the flow of illegal substances wasn't just a job, it was a business. A lucrative, ever-expanding business. Capone's empire had fallen because of the changing tides, but the city's thirst for power never did. It only changed shape. The same streets that Capone had once ruled now belonged to men who didn't need to raise a gun to get what they wanted. They controlled the system, not through brute force but through subtlety, through influence. They knew that it wasn't the loudest man who won the game. It was the one who stayed quiet, kept his head down, and worked his deals from behind the curtain. Capone's name was still whispered on the streets, not as a warning but as a reminder of what could happen if you weren't careful. His fall was inevitable. The feds, the public, and the political climate all worked against him in the end. But for the new generation, the fall of Capone was something to learn from, not something to fear. They knew how to move quietly. They knew how to bend the system without breaking it. But Chicago's underworld wasn't just a place for gangsters. It was a place for everyone who wanted to cut a deal, for those who found their way into the cracks and crevices of society. Politicians, businessmen, judges, even law enforcement. They all knew the game. They all knew the stakes. And for the right price, they all played a part in it. Capone had once owned this city, but the city was a beast that couldn't be tamed. No one could rule it forever, not even someone as ruthless and powerful as Capone. But the game he left behind, that was forever. The underworld had adapted. The tactics had shifted. But the hunger for power, that was still there, always. And as new names began to rise, as new players took their place in the game, they knew one thing: the rules might change, but the game never ends. It looks like you're asking to continue. Let me pick up from where we left off. By the mid-1950s, Chicago's criminal landscape had been thoroughly reshaped. The loud, aggressive gangster, the one who stood tall in the spotlight like Capone, was no longer the dominant force. Instead, it was the quiet men, the ones who ran their operations from behind the scenes, in dimly lit offices, and at backroom deals. The game had evolved, and those who wanted to play, those who wanted to make a mark, had to adapt. The rise of organized crime families after Capone's fall didn't happen overnight. It was methodical, calculated, and deadly efficient. These new players had learned well from the past. They knew Capone's story was both a success and a failure. They understood how the spotlight could be both a weapon and a liability. Where Capone had built his empire on violence, intimidation, and brute force, the new generation of gangsters built theirs on connections, secrecy, and manipulation. But Chicago's streets still remembered the old ways. The presence of law enforcement, the changing political landscape, the constant tightening of regulations, these were all factors in the shifting balance of power. While some old-time mobsters tried to hold onto Capone's legacy, there were others who understood that the game had moved on. Drugs, racketeering, and more sophisticated illegal enterprises were where the real money now lay, and the fight for control of these new commodities would see the rise of men who knew how to navigate the complex web of law, politics, and organized crime. And yet, no matter how carefully the new blood played their hand, Capone's shadow remained. His name still carried weight, still served as a warning. Not just for what he had accomplished, but for what had happened when he got too greedy, too visible, too brazen. The rise and fall of Capone had shown everyone the dangers of becoming too powerful in a system that was still very much a game of cat and mouse. Even as the new generation sought to carve out their empires in the shadows, they couldn't escape the reality that the government was still watching. Federal agents had learned from their failures with Capone. They had become more efficient, more technologically savvy. Wiretaps, surveillance, and the growing reach of the FBI meant that the underworld could no longer operate with the same level of openness it once did. Yet despite the mounting pressure from law enforcement, these new players understood something. Even when you're in the shadows, power still moves in the right hands. The story of Capone didn't just end with his death or his conviction. His legacy, his methods, and his influence remained in the game, evolving with the times. The men who had learned from Capone didn't just rely on his violent tactics. They took what worked and adapted. They knew how to make money without ever getting their hands dirty, how to control the flow of drugs and alcohol, how to keep their dealings so secret that law enforcement couldn't touch them. But there was always a risk. Always. The game that Capone had mastered was still a game of power, and those who reached for the throne had to be prepared to face what came next. Because no matter how smart you were, no matter how careful you played, every king eventually meets their end. The only question was when, and how would it happen? And in Chicago, in the underworld, the question that lingered over everything was whether any of these new players could learn the final lesson that Capone had never quite grasped. That the game doesn't just consume your rivals, it consumes you too. The underworld, while shifting and evolving, was still marked by the scars of its past. The story of Al Capone, even in death, had become a blueprint. His methods, his empire, and his eventual downfall lingered like a shadow over the generations that followed. And in this new world, the city of Chicago, a city that had borne witness to Capone's rise, his dominance, and his fall, was changing. The 1960s brought about a new breed of gangster. They no longer lived in the open, parading their power like Capone had done. They were in the shadows, moving quietly behind the curtains of politics, law enforcement, and business. They didn't need to flaunt their wealth or engage in street battles. Instead, they used their money to buy influence, control, and silence. The era of open violence had ended, replaced by a more refined game. It was about corruption, about buying off the right people, judges, police officers, politicians, and ensuring that the system worked for you, not the other way around. The law was still there, but it was bending. It was being manipulated, just as Capone had once manipulated the streets. But these men had learned to be even more subtle, more patient, and less visible. They didn't need to shoot their way to power. They had learned how to move in the silence, to orchestrate events without ever leaving a trace. But while the game had evolved, the old rules still applied. The hunger for power, the desire to control the city's flow, whether it was drugs, gambling, or even the everyday businesses, was still very much alive. And while these new players might have been quieter, they were just as dangerous, if not more so. They knew that in the game of crime there were no second chances. The pressure was always on. The city was still Chicago, the birthplace of Capone's empire, but it had learned from his downfall. There were no more public gang wars or high-profile arrests. Instead, the city had grown more sophisticated, as had the criminal organizations that ran it. The drug trade was expanding, and with it, the wealth and influence that came with it. The Mafia had evolved. The Italian and Irish families had been joined by others, Mexican cartels, Asian syndicates, bringing with them new methods and new rules. The businesses were different now, too. Instead of warehouses turned into illegal breweries, the new game was about shipping lanes, drug running, and laundering money through legitimate businesses. The people who ran these operations were often invisible, operating behind legitimate storefronts, sometimes even running charities, front organizations, or construction companies. The game had grown more intricate, more dangerous, but more difficult to trace. Even in the 1970s, as the city tried to clean itself up, the criminals adapted. They had learned that controlling the system was more profitable than fighting it, and they knew, just as Capone had known, that the city wasn't about to take the power back from them. It was too much of a cash cow. Too many people were bought off, too many people were paid to look the other way. The game had been fixed long ago, and then came the federal crackdown. The DEA, FBI, and local authorities had begun to coordinate in ways they hadn't before. They were finally learning to play the game as well as the criminals did. They learned how to target the money, the businesses, the connections, and it wasn't just about busting the drug trade anymore. It was about hitting the criminal networks at their core. The rise of federal task forces brought a new level of scrutiny to the operations that ran in the shadows. But by the time the feds had caught up with the players of the 1970s and 80s, it was almost too late. These new gangsters had built walls around their operations that were difficult to penetrate. Capone's legacy wasn't just about his control over Chicago. It was about how the city had adapted to the changing criminal landscape. His story had taught the next generation of gangsters how to rise, how to control, and how to survive. The lesson was clear. The best way to run an empire wasn't through flash and violence. It was through control, secrecy, and patience. But despite the changes, the echoes of Capone's rule still could be felt. His name was still used as a benchmark for those who sought power. And for those who thought they could play the game the same way Capone had, there was always a reminder that things could turn south quickly. The feds would come. The game would eventually catch up to you. The streets had been reshaped, but the hunger for power never disappeared. It only morphed into something more dangerous, more hidden. The new players learned well, but they also knew that Capone's fall wasn't just a story, it was a warning. In this game, no one was untouchable. The 1980s brought a seismic shift in Chicago's criminal landscape. The old names, the families that once ruled the streets like kings, had lost their grip. But what replaced them wasn't a vacuum. It was a calculated evolution of crime, one that saw the rise of even darker, more complex forces. The city still bore the scars of Capone's reign. The street corners, the alleyways, and the backrooms of the city's clubs, these were places where old memories lingered. The stories of Capone's rule were still told, not just as folklore, but as the blueprint for how a city could be bent, controlled, and ultimately consumed by one man's ambition. Yet the new generation wasn't concerned with living up to the legend. No, they had their own ambitions, their own ideas of power. They understood that the game had evolved. This wasn't about running speakeasies and bootlegging anymore. No, the real money now came from drugs, cartels, and international syndicates. The old players, the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, had been dethroned. In their place, new alliances formed. The Colombian cartels had risen to dominance, and with them came a ruthless new brand of crime. They didn't care about loyalty in the same way Capone had. Their empire wasn't built on influence or city politics. It was built on terror. They ruled through fear, violence, and intimidation, controlling vast networks that spanned continents. But while Capone's empire had been about brute force, the new wave of criminals understood the power of the mind. These men and women weren't looking to be kings in the same way Capone had. They didn't need to be flashy. They learned from the past, knew that remaining in the shadows, pulling the strings without anyone noticing, was how you really controlled the game. The 1980s saw the rise of narcotics. The crack epidemic took hold, and with it, a whole new world of illegal wealth. Gangsters had always made money off the misery of others, but the trade of crack cocaine was on another level. It was cheap, highly addictive, and spread like wildfire through the streets of Chicago and beyond. The dealers, the distributors, the suppliers, all made millions. But it wasn't just the streets that were affected. The reach of these operations went far beyond Chicago's borders. International trade routes were now the lifeblood of the city's criminal enterprises. In the shadows of all this, the legacy of Capone's operations was never far behind. The Mafia had adapted, but they weren't dead. They had simply evolved. They no longer needed to run the streets themselves. Instead, they partnered with the new generation, cutting deals with cartels, with foreign interests, with anyone who could help expand their operations. The connections Capone had forged were still in place, still being used. It wasn't about trying to outdo Capone anymore. It was about learning from his rise and fall. Capone's former stronghold, Cicero, had long since been overtaken by a new order. The police had been cleansed of Capone's influence, but the town itself was forever marked by his shadow. It wasn't just about the violence anymore. It was about the system Capone had built, the one that had corrupted everything from the cops to the politicians. Those old habits died hard, and as the narcotics trade exploded, those same connections were put to use in a more covert, more dangerous way. The system that Capone had once controlled, while it no longer belonged to him, was still deeply entrenched in the city's underbelly. The new players didn't need to destroy it. They had learned to navigate it, use it, manipulate it to their advantage. As the drug trade flourished, so did the violence. The streets became battlegrounds once again, not between rival gangs, but between those who wanted to control the narcotics trade. The cartels fought viciously, with every inch of territory becoming a war zone. The new generation of gangsters, who once operated in the shadows, now fought openly, with bloodshed splattering across the city's headlines. But Chicago had seen this before. The fear and chaos were familiar as the stories of Capone's reign. The streets may have changed, but the violence never did. And through it all, the city itself was evolving, adjusting to the changing tides of criminal enterprise. By the early 1990s, the old-school gangsters, who had once built their empires on the backs of prohibition and bootlegging, had mostly faded into the background. But the city that Capone had once ruled was still under the influence of the lessons he had taught, lessons about power, loyalty, and how to stay on top. It was just that now, those lessons were applied in a different way. The violence was still there, but the power was in the hands of those who understood the new dynamics. The game was different now. And so, in the background of it all, Capone's name still had weight. It still meant something. He had been the archetype, the one who had taught the streets how to rise, how to build an empire, and how quickly everything could come crashing down. His story was never really forgotten. It was still being used, still being adapted. His legend didn't just live on in the stories of the streets, it lived in the methods that criminals used to control the city. The streets of Chicago were still a place where power was fought for, where lives were bought and sold, and where no one could ever fully escape the game. Capone had been the first to show the world how it was done, but in the end, it was his own ambition that had cost him. The game had outlasted him. And for the new players, those who understood the quiet, strategic method of taking control, they were destined to continue where Capone had left off. Chicago's criminal empire may have morphed, but it had never left. And the city, it would always remember the man who had ruled it all, even if his name had faded into myth. Because in Chicago, there was one truth that always held. The game never ends. It just changes players. As the 1990s dawned, Chicago found itself at the crossroads of a new era, an era that was defined not just by the legacy of Al Capone, but by the modern-day players who were quietly taking the reins. The stories of the past, those of Capone's rise and fall, had become lessons passed down in hushed tones from one generation to the next. But what Capone's generation had known, violence, intimidation, and open control, had now transformed into something far more calculated and insidious. The criminal underworld had changed shape. Where Capone had once run a blatant empire of illegal liquor, gambling, and prostitution, the new kings of Chicago's streets had adapted to a new reality: drugs, money laundering, and complex international trade. The days of the loud gangster were over, and the age of the invisible kingpin had begun. But while the face of crime had changed, its core remained the same. The hunger for power, control, and wealth had not wavered. The men who walked the same streets that Capone had once dominated were playing a different game, one where strategy, manipulation, and subtlety were the key to surviving and thriving. The players in the city's criminal scene were now highly organized, with syndicates operating in a way Capone would never have imagined. The Colombian cartels had risen to prominence, making billions off of the drugs flooding into the United States. Their operations were far more sophisticated than Capone's ever were. These new criminals knew how to keep their heads down, stay out of sight, and let the money flow while the law remained in the dark. But even as new power structures emerged, the shadows of Capone's reign couldn't be shaken off so easily. The blueprint he had left behind was still in play. The lessons learned from Capone's rise and fall had been burned into the very fabric of the underworld. The men who ran Chicago's criminal operations understood the need for loyalty, secrecy, and the quiet execution of power. It wasn't about control over the streets anymore. It was about control over the economy, over the very flow of money itself. And with money came influence. With influence came power. And with power, well, there was no such thing as being untouchable. The new generation learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew that Capone's downfall had come at the hands of law enforcement, specifically the relentless efforts of federal agents like Elliot Ness. They understood that visibility was a liability. Capone had wanted to be feared. He had wanted his name to echo through every corner of the city, to be known by everyone, to be a king in the truest sense of the word. But the new players realized that Capone's loudness had ultimately been his undoing. The law had caught up with him because he had made too many enemies. They learned the value of staying in the shadows, of moving quietly and calculatingly. But as much as they tried to remain unseen, the new kings of the city couldn't outrun their own ambition. The game had changed, but the stakes remained high. The feds, who had once gone after Capone with a vengeance, were now focusing on the new players, these invisible syndicates that had risen to power. The DEA, FBI, and other federal agencies had grown stronger, more organized, and more determined to root out the networks of drug cartels and money launderers that had proliferated in the wake of Prohibition. Even the Mafia, which had once been the dominant force in organized crime, was shifting its focus. No longer was it about the flashy lifestyle of Capone's time. The Mafia had learned how to blend into the background, to make money without the same level of violence and fear. They had adapted, working with cartels, diversifying their operations, and keeping a low profile while still exerting influence over the city's political and financial systems. But no matter how much they tried to change, Chicago's criminal underworld couldn't escape its history. The city's streets, its alleys, its dark corners, they still remembered Capone. His name still carried weight, still represented the peak of organized crime, the epitome of what it meant to control the city, to bend the law to your will. The feds knew it too. They knew that even as the players changed, the game remained the same. And so they watched closely, waiting for the moment when the new players would make the same mistakes Capone had. They understood that the city's criminal networks, though evolving, were still vulnerable. The money trail, the connections, the weaknesses, they could all be exposed. And when they were, the game would shift once again. The new players in the game, the ones who had learned to move quietly, to stay in the shadows, couldn't outrun the legacy of Capone. His influence still seeped into every crack and crevice of Chicago. The game had changed, yes, but it had never really left. The hunger for power remained, passed down from one generation to the next, always evolving but always rooted in the same core desire for control. And as the years went on, Chicago's streets became a battleground once again, not for dominance but for survival. The city had been shaped by Capone, by his rise, his reign, and his eventual fall. But the players who came after him understood something Capone hadn't fully realized, that the game was never really about winning. It was about staying alive. And in that sense, Capone's story was never truly over. His empire may have crumbled, but the game, the one he had played so ruthlessly, was still being played. And in the shadows, his legacy lived on. The game was never over. It was just being played differently now. As the 21st century dawned, Chicago's criminal underworld continued to evolve, but the game was as alive as ever. Capone's legend, though a distant memory to some, still resonated in the heart of the city. His empire may have fallen, but the infrastructure he had built, the connections, the influence, had been passed down. The city was not the same. The crime waves that had once washed over Chicago, the violence and chaos, had receded into the background, but the undercurrent remained. The syndicates that had risen in Capone's wake were now operating at a global scale, their operations far more intricate and complex than anything Capone had ever conceived. The internet, global communication networks, and international shipping had opened up opportunities that Capone could never have dreamed of. But Chicago, always a city of secrets and power, still held onto its old ways. The modern-day crime syndicates understood one key lesson from Capone: control the system, and you control everything. These new players knew that to rise to the top, they needed more than just street power. They needed a seat at the table. And that meant finding ways to operate in the gray areas of the law, making deals with politicians, leveraging media influence, and gaining access to the financial networks that ran the city. In the world that Capone had once dominated, the new players found their place. They didn't need to flaunt their wealth or threaten their way to the top. These new gangsters were businessmen, entrepreneurs of the underworld, working in shadows. And they weren't just dealing in drugs, guns, and illicit trade. They were in banking, real estate, technology, and even entertainment. The new generation had realized that to truly control the city, they had to control more than just the streets. They had to control the economy. In the back rooms of expensive downtown hotels, behind closed doors of corporate boardrooms, these new players were quietly pulling strings. Their wealth wasn't just in cash. It was in assets. They had diversified their operations, ensuring they had a finger in every pot. They were no longer dependent on any one source of income. They were smarter, they were quieter, they were more dangerous. But Chicago's criminal enterprises were still haunted by the ghost of Capone. His story, both the triumphs and the eventual collapse of his empire, was the roadmap. The lessons had been learned: control, loyalty, fear, and most importantly, the subtlety to operate without attracting too much attention. This was a game of patience, and Capone, for all his faults, had been patient. He had known when to act and when to retreat. The men who followed in his footsteps had inherited those lessons. Still, as the digital age unfolded, a new kind of power began to emerge, one that Capone had never anticipated: cybercrime. The rise of the internet changed the way money moved and how businesses operated. New syndicates began to rise in the shadows of the online world, finding ways to manipulate markets, steal identities, and launder money through digital channels. For the first time, criminal organizations could operate at a scale that Capone could never have dreamed of. They could work from anywhere, communicate instantly, and move money across borders without ever physically touching it. The world had become smaller and more interconnected, and crime had grown in scale and complexity. The criminals of the new age knew that to survive in this new world, they needed to be more elusive than ever. They understood the need for secrecy, the importance of operating in the hidden spaces of the city, both physically and digitally. They had learned from Capone's story that overt violence and showmanship weren't the keys to power. The true masters of the game were the ones who operated without ever being seen. The new players, the ones who understood how to control the flow of information, were the ones who would rise to the top. They weren't just looking for money, they were looking for something more powerful, control over the city's future. But as always, there were risks. In the world Capone had once ruled, no one ever stayed at the top forever. And as new syndicates rose, so too did new enemies. The digital age didn't just bring new opportunities, it brought new threats. The same technology that enabled criminals to thrive also enabled law enforcement to catch them. As the feds and the government adapted, so did the criminals. There were whispers in the air, rumors that the same tactics Capone had used to evade the law were being brought back to life. Some of the new players, those who felt the walls closing in, began to return to Capone's old ways. They used their influence to bend the system, to bribe officials, to play the game from within. They knew that the feds were always watching, but they also understood that in this game, it was better to have allies inside the system than to try and fight it head-on. Capone had understood that. He had known how to work with the system and manipulate it to his advantage. His legacy wasn't just in his criminal operations. It was in his ability to control the systems around him, to make people work for him, to create a world where the law could be bent, twisted, and corrupted. The new players in Chicago's underworld had learned from Capone's successes, but they also learned from his mistakes. They understood that to truly stay on top, they had to be invisible. The days of running speakeasies and shaking down businesses were gone. Now, it was about being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was about using the system to your advantage, controlling the flow of money and information while remaining out of sight. Chicago's streets had changed, but the game was the same. The hunger for power, control, and wealth never truly left. It just evolved, taking on new forms, new faces, and new methods. The city Capone had ruled had learned from his rise and fall, and the players who followed in his footsteps were determined to never make the same mistakes. Al Capone might have been gone, but the game was eternal. As the years stretched on, the criminal landscape of Chicago evolved into something more refined, more calculated. But there was always one shadow looming over the entire underworld, a shadow cast by a man who had taught them all how to play the game. Al Capone. The streets of Chicago, even now, still whispered his name, not out of reverence but out of a quiet acknowledgement that his reign, while violent and fleeting, had left a mark on the city that would never truly fade. Capone's story was the blueprint. His rise and fall were the lessons of ambition and hubris. It was no longer about muscle, it was about control, power, subtlety. The men and women who had risen in the wake of his empire understood that they couldn't make the same mistakes he did. They couldn't draw attention. They couldn't flaunt their success. They had to move quietly, operate behind closed doors, and pull the strings from a distance. In this modern age, they learned to navigate new technologies, new markets. The drug trade, the arms trade, money laundering, all of it moved differently now, but the principles were the same. The lesson was clear. The game doesn't end, it just adapts. You either adapt with it or get left behind. But as the new kings and queens of Chicago's underworld expanded their empires, they were still haunted by the same old fear. The same fear Capone had lived with, the fear of being exposed. The feds were watching. Technology had made the game harder to play. The network of corruption that had once protected Capone was no longer as effective. The lessons were still there, but the tools had changed. The game had shifted, and while the players were smarter, the risk of exposure was greater than ever. It's a hard truth to accept that even the strongest empire can crumble. Capone had built his kingdom on the backs of others. He had bought off the law, manipulated the system, and crushed anyone who opposed him. He had thought he was untouchable, and for a while he was. But in the end, it was his own overconfidence, his own inability to hide in the shadows that brought him down. Capone had once been the epitome of gangster royalty, but in the end, even he couldn't outrun his own ambition. His empire fell, and with it, the idea that anyone, no matter how powerful, could remain untouchable. His name became a lesson, a story told to each new generation of criminals. And the lesson was always the same. The higher you rise, the harder you fall. The game can chew you up. It doesn't care who you are. The streets, as they always do, changed with time. The technology, the methods, and the players evolved. But the hunger for power never ceased. It was a new game, but the players were still following the same path Capone had walked. In the end, the final lesson of Capone's story was this. No matter how much you control, no matter how high you rise, the game is never truly yours. The game will always own you. And so, the cycle repeats.